Hey guys, welcome back to Based. This month, we're going to talk about the men's rights movement and specifically the potential bias against men in our legal system. As you probably know, the libertarian movement is pretty male-heavy. That's starting to change in recent years, but it tracks that a large percentage of my audience is also made up of men. And one thing those men have frequently asked me to touch on is the men's rights movement. But frankly, I've recoiled from doing it for many years, and for good reason, because there are elements of this movement that are frankly gross, misogynistic, and violent. But I've recently taken the time to dig into the issues, and I've come away thinking that there are two sides to the men's rights movement, one valid, one not valid. And I think the issues under the valid side of this movement deserve our attention. So today, I'm going to distinguish between the two sides of the movement first, and then we're going to get down to business on the issues. So what is the men's rights movement? I'm going to read from one of the large advocacy groups within the sector called the Men's Group, and they define it like this. Activists argue that society has become biased and sexist against men. They also argue that men face discrimination from the media, government, and Supreme Court for being male. Men's rights groups fight against custody laws that favor mothers over fathers, violence against men, false rape allegations, disproportionate male prison sentencing, and conscription. For instance, whenever a female is overlooked over a role in the office, the company is deemed as discriminatory. However, when a male colleague loses a position to a female worker, it is deemed as normal. These are some of the inequalities men's rights groups strive to address. Those are their words. Now, on its face, I'd say there's a lot in that statement we're going to agree about. I consider myself a feminist, and that means I advocate for women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. True feminism is the belief that all people should have equal rights, equal opportunity, and equal command of their own destiny. But just like the men's rights movement has two sides to it, one vile and one valid, I'd argue so does the feminist movement. There is a side to the feminist movement that truly does hate men, and that sees them as inferior or wants them to have fewer rights. I disavow those people just as I disavow the components of the men's rights movement who feel similarly towards women. And let's address that side of their movement briefly. There are increasingly vocal groups of men in society who simply hate women. They hate the gains feminism has made, they can't compete with women on an equal playing field, and they seek to diminish the rights of women so that they can feel better about their puny existence. These elements include groups like incels, components of the alt-right and white nationalists, trads who want to force their social conservatism on others, the pickup artist community, and the men going their own way movement. Some people within these groups will go so far as to say that rape should be legal. They downplay domestic violence, they harass women online, and they actually eschew love and relationships in retaliation against feminism, which I think is really funny. Like, oh no, you can't date us, you can't date a misogynist, like take back our rights so we can have them. Like, we're good on you guys too. I joke, but these are hate groups that do not believe in equality, and they're made up of vile people. It's a shame that they've been able to co-opt the men's rights movement to an extent. But as a libertarian, I know the feeling. Our movement is no stranger to vile people trying to co-opt it and corrupt our message. So throughout this episode, it is important that we distinguish between some of the very real concerns men face in our society and the creepy underbelly of unsuccessful men who just hate women. Now, back to the valid side of the men's rights movement. To reiterate, these are their top concerns: custody laws that favor mothers over fathers, violence against men, false accusations, over-incarceration, conscription, and mental health. There's a lot to dig into here. But first, for those of you who may be skeptical, let's examine the state of things in our society. I know as a woman, it can be hard to feel sympathy for men a lot of the time. I'm just keeping it real. As a woman, it often feels like there is so much we have to overcome to this day. And if you're like me, a lot of the talking points we hear from the men's rights movement can sound like an excuse for sexism or thinly veiled desires to return to societal structures that oppressed women. But when you step back and take a look around, it actually becomes pretty clear that while women may still have a lot to overcome, men really aren't doing well in our society lately. In fact, a new bit of research found that in 91 of the 134 countries evaluated, women face fewer net disadvantages than men based on metrics that included literacy, primary and secondary school enrollment, years one could expect a healthy lifestyle, and life satisfaction. Women are now more likely to go to college, more likely to graduate college, and more likely to obtain a graduate degree. Men are 3.88 times more likely to die by suicide than women. They have higher rates of substance abuse. They are substantially more likely to have a dangerous job and to die on the job. Their average life expectancy is 5 years less than women. 19% of men are classified as having a gaming addiction. Porn addictions are up. 34% of men are overweight. The list could go on, but you get the picture. As a whole, there are a lot of men facing very serious issues in our society right now, and when they talk about them, they're often met with derision. And I have a lot of men in my life that I love. I've been very fortunate to be surrounded by upstanding men of character in my family, from my dad to my brothers to cousins and uncles. I have reaped the benefits of always having strong men backing me up. I care about these issues because I care about them. And I think the family is a microcosm for society. I look at my family and my own life, and I can't help but think what our society might look like if it were filled with men like those in my family. And while there are always elements of self-responsibility that must be emphasized when it comes to these matters, anyone who cares about liberty should care deeply if the state is putting policies into place that hurt people, especially when those policies disproportionately hurt one group of people more than others. Additionally, it's important that as libertarians we keep something in mind. When we discuss societal problems, we do not have to call for state solutions, but that doesn't mean we should just ignore these problems or have no solutions for them at all. What kind of ideology would that be? Not a very good one, and certainly not one that would attract many people. Life is hard, get a helmet, that's a catchphrase. It isn't a political ideology. If we want people to be won to our way of thinking, which usually does not involve traditional government solutions, we need to be able to show that there are better free market solutions to these problems. Anything less than that is a lazy ideology and what I like to call bad capitalism. You should care about people when they're hurting. You should especially care when the government is hurting people in your name and with your resources. And you should also recognize that hurt people hurt people. The growth of the alt-right and some of these hate groups within the men's rights movement is evidence of that. The fact that single white men are the most likely demographic to be a mass murderer shows that. The fact that men make up the majority of violent criminals and victims shows that. So if we want to actually stop misogyny and sexism and the growth of the alt-right and other fringe groups that are preying on hurting, disaffected people, the best thing we can do is start to show up and show sympathy and hopefully even solutions for their problems. So let's break down some of the top issues the men's rights movement is trying to elevate. For time's sake, we're going to briefly go over some and then really dig into others. First, they elevate the problems with violence against men and how overlooked this is in our system. As someone who spent the bulk of my political career working in criminal justice reform, let me just say, yup. Men make up almost 80% of all murders worldwide. In the US, their homicide rate is almost 10 times that of females. They're also more likely to be victims of other crimes too, like drug-related crimes and gang-related crimes. And though they experience far lower rates of violence for things like domestic abuse and rape, they do experience that kind of violence too. And it is worth mentioning here that while all rapes and incidents of domestic abuse are severely underreported, and for good reason because cops don't do anything about them, it's likely social stigmas make men even less likely to report these incidents to police. Now, in response to these crime statistics, many will point out that men are also far more likely to be perpetrators of violence than women, leading to their involvement in more violence against them. And this isn't incorrect. Men commit 90+% of murders based on one global study, and intimate partner violence remains the biggest health threat to women. But I want to reiterate something I said earlier, which is that hurt people hurt people. From my years in criminal justice reform, if I could impart one piece of knowledge to people about violence, it would be this. The dichotomy that you have in your mind of victim versus perpetrator rarely exist. They are almost always one and the same because violence is cyclical in nature. Most people are first victims of violence many times over before they too themselves become violent, and then they are met with more violence from our system. And no one is ever safer for it. If we want to get serious about violence, we have to get serious about trauma interventions and violence disruptions, programs that largely take place outside of policing and do the real work of stopping cycles of violence. These are serious criminal justice reforms that we should all be supporting. And the best thing about them is that they're local, they're often less costly than our bloated policing system, and they take a more limited government approach to crime. That's the policy change that needs to take place here. But there's also a societal change that needs to take place too. And that's that we need to stop diminishing violence against men. It is not okay for your partner to harm you, physically, verbally, or emotionally. Abuse is abuse. And men who find themselves on the receiving end of it should get the same sympathy and support from their community as women do, which is actually not even saying that much. Our society needs to be better on this all around. Stop asking people why they didn't leave and instead ask how you can help. Stop laughing at the antics of abusers and instead intervene and speak up. Let them know others are watching them and won't excuse their behavior. Next, the movement flags two other issues that also fall under the criminal justice system, and those are false accusations and over-incarceration, which I think are somewhat intertwined if you think about it. The US has a massive over-incarceration problem driven by wrongful convictions, prosecutions pushing everyone into plea deals, which I covered in the prosecutor episode, and a whole litany of things being made into crimes by our lawmakers that are victimless, nonviolent offenses no one should be in jail over. It is an atrocious, disgusting, inhumane system, and it makes a complete mockery of the principles we were founded upon. The American criminal justice system holds almost 2.3 million people in 1,833 state prisons, 110 federal prisons, 1,772 juvenile correctional facilities, 3,134 local jails, 218 immigration detention facilities, and 80 Indian county jails, as well as military prisons, civil commitment centers, state psychiatric hospitals, and prisons in the U.S. territories. USA. In fact, despite making up close to 5% of the global population, the US has more than 20% of the world's prison population. And since 1970, our incarcerated population has increased by 500%. Under this system, men are over 8 times more likely than women to be incarcerated in prison at least once during their lifetime. A man has a 9% chance in his lifetime of going to prison, while a woman has a 1.1% chance. Now, some of that is correlation given the violence rates among men we discussed above. But certainly, they are also more likely to go to jail or prison for things no one should be locked up for. They are also more likely to be victims of wrongful convictions, which is a pervasive problem in our system. We have discovered over 2,500 wrongful convictions in recent years, and that's just the people who've been able to get the external resources they need to plead their case. Of those, men are far more likely to be wrongfully convicted, and Black men in particular are the most impacted, with a rate that is 7 times higher than that of white people wrongfully convicted. But Hannah, there's no such thing as systemic racism. Now, here's where I need to make a major point. While men are more likely to be incarcerated and more likely to be wrongfully incarcerated, it is not because so many women are just out here lying on them in these streets. This part of the men's rights movement is a false narrative that needs to be debunked and put to bed immediately. More than half of all wrongful convictions are due to government misconduct. Shocker. That would include things like police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, judicial misconduct, corruption in the labs, and general mistakes. The misapplication of forensic science is responsible for 45% of wrongful convictions. False eyewitness identification in 70% of wrongful convictions. False confessions in 25% of cases. Jailhouse informants in 19% of cases. You get the picture. There is a very seedy part of the men's rights movement that wants to undermine the very real and persistent threat of rape, abuse, and murder that men pose towards women. I firmly believe most of the men in that camp are abusers themselves, because trying to gaslight and diminish the treatment of others is the #1 rule in the abuser's playbook. Run, do not walk from anyone in that camp. The truth is, most rapes do not get reported at all. Why? For a number of reasons. 1, cops aren't going to do crap about it. We have thousands of untested rape kits they're literally running out the clock on. 2, given the fact they're unlikely to even get a rape kit tested, the downsides to reporting rape and abuse far outweigh any positives. Unless we're talking about a man with extreme amounts of fame, money, or power, which is not most of you, women have virtually no incentive to lie or falsely report, and just about every reason to stay mum. In fact, some studies show as many as 60% of sexual assaults are not reported. When it comes to the rates of false accusations, this kind of thing is admittedly hard to track. Most wrongful convictions are not discovered because the people at the receiving end simply don't have the resources to prove their innocence. And barring exculpatory evidence, we can't say for sure how many people are in prison due to false accusations. But estimates show over the past 20 years that only 2 to 10% of rape allegations prove to be false. Again, you have to look at the incentive structure here. Women can lose their jobs for coming forward about an assault, and that can result in them never being hired in their industry again. They incur the wrath of the abuser when they come forward, making coming forward a very dangerous time for them. They have to relive the trauma publicly over and over. It is no walk in the park. And again, for what? Police do not even test the rape kits. If you're a celebrity or a politician, I get this fear being a real threat for you. Otherwise, I remain entirely unconvinced. I think this is one point that the men's rights movement way overblows, and they do it to the extreme of negating real abuse against women. That is not the behavior of a quality man. On to another point they bring up, which is conscription. I'll keep this one simple. Yes. Throughout most of our history, only men have been eligible for the draft, and it's wrong. The draft is wrong. Conscription is immoral. No one should be forced to go fight, kill other innocent people, lose their limbs, risk their lives, and potentially lose their sanity to fight in the banal, vile wars our governments create. The draft should be abolished. This is a no-brainer. No one should be subjected to it ever, ever, ever. But the fact that they've done it to men and not to women is a clear violation of the 14th Amendment's equal application of the law. On to mental health. You guys know I'm a huge mental health advocate, so this is one I care deeply about. I volunteered at NAMI early on in my career and first got involved in criminal justice reform working on these issues. I already discussed many of the sad statistics around men's mental health earlier in the show, so I won't reiterate, but I do think there's a lot to be concerned with here. Not only are men more likely to die of suicide or deaths of despair, they're also more likely to be victims of the loneliness epidemic. Thomas Joyner, in his book Lonely at the Top, says that men have made a Dorian Gray-like trade of success in the external world for a deep sense of loneliness, emptiness, and disconnection. And what he means by that is that boys tend to start out feeling just as connected in their close friendships as girls do, but then they neglect their personal relationships to pursue external success. When men lose the social structures provided in high school and college, they often find themselves adrift, unsure how to establish or maintain close relationships with other men or women. And increasingly, we see that adult men in our society have no support system. And that not only hurts them, it hurts their partners too, who are then left to do the emotional labor of forging social interactions for their husband. Not only that, but women tend to rely on a really wide community for support. We seek out therapists, we have large social groups, seek out self-help and mentors and career advisors. And men, on the other hand, rely on their wives to provide all of that, which creates significant strain on relationships and leaves women feeling like they're dealing with emotional gold diggers. No one person can do all of that work for you. And I don't really think there is a governmental solution here, but there certainly is a societal one. We need to stop stigmatizing men seeking mental health treatment. It should be treated as routine. You go see your regular doctor every year for a checkup. At the bare minimum, you should be seeking out a mental health checkup. We also need to stop telling men that this is just the way it is, to suck it up, to keep their heads down and provide. And this is an area where I think the good feminists and the good men's rights advocates could come together. Because we also believe that the old school 1950s societal system hurt women and men. And studies back that up. Men who identify with an old school masculine ideology are worse off. They're less likely to seek psychological help, more likely to feel isolated. Toxic masculinity hurts everyone, but it especially hurts men. Men are entitled to emotion and feelings, to have rich and complex inner lives. They too need community and support, and to not always have to be the strong one. I really hate the cultural forces that continue to try to push men into these sad, boxed-in lives. Because men who are thriving, they are the ones who have broken out of these stereotypes. Men who are actually strong are vulnerable and open. They don't need to control the world around them because they're in control of themselves. They can ask for help and take advice. They can show up for others on an emotional level as well as a physical level. And these are the kinds of real alpha males our society is desperate for. But before we can get it, we have to help men break some of these chains of gender stereotypes. Men need to be taught to seek help, to put themselves first sometimes, to build community and invest in relationships. They need to be seen and treated as whole people, not just providers. And as a society, we have to start making that difference at an individual level by supporting men in our own lives in this capacity. The last subject I want to cover under this topic is the court system and the way it impacts men who are fathers and who go through a divorce. Of all the pernicious gender stereotypes in our society, the one that portrays men as incompetent fathers or bumbling partners is perhaps the most harmful. And I truly don't know where this came from, but I remember watching sitcoms as a kid and being bothered by it even then because it did not represent my father or the other men in my life. Having a strong father is one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given. He has always made me feel secure and provided for and deeply loved. I often have people ask me how I'm so confident as a woman in a society that constantly works to tear us down and harm our self-esteem. And I credit my parents and the words they spoke over me as a child for that, but especially my father. He would always tell me how beautiful I was, how strong and smart and capable I was. And having that voice in my head made a real impact because I believed him. I never had to worry about my safety because my dad was always looking out for me. Even now, I often joke that he watches my location tracker like it's Fox News, and I'm not really joking, he does. He taught me my work ethic, how to research, how to think through things. My dad is entirely irreplaceable in my life. I would be a drastically different person without him. I truly cannot fathom moving through the world without the security of knowing he is behind me. And yet, this relationship is something courts rob children of every day in this country. Women initiate close to 70% of all divorces. And to really have an honest conversation here, we need to look at why that is. One note, this imbalance is not seen in heterosexual relationships outside of marriage. Men are just as likely to break off other relationships. Women are specifically more likely to end marriages. Some studies indicate women are more acutely aware of problems within a marriage, and a whole body of research shows marriage is often better for men. To be clear, both men and women benefit from marriage, but men seem to benefit more overall. In addition to being happier and healthier than bachelors, married men earn more money and live longer. And men can reap such benefits even from mediocre marriages, while for women, the benefits of marriage are more strongly linked to marital equality. But while marital equality plays a significant factor in women's happiness and well-being in a marriage, it's important to note that we are still only a couple of decades into learning how to structure the home and relationships in an equal world. And I think we're struggling with that. Other countries like Japan are struggling too. Women increasingly don't want to get married or have kids because they know they can't have it all, and the burden of working outside the home while still picking up the bulk of the labor within it are not a bargain. A lot of women initiate divorce because they're tired of doing it all. This is a real conversation couples should have before marriage and before kids. How are you going to split the load? How will you ensure the dad still gets to see his kids and the mom doesn't end up doing all of the emotional labor at home? These are big communication issues that easily lead to divorce if you're not on the same page. All of that to say, there is no single reason divorce happens, but there are many societal struggles we can currently point to that make women more likely to leave. And then there's one big governmental incentive we can point to that may also contribute, which is that when women initiate divorce, the odds are stacked in their favor. I've thankfully never been through divorce in any capacity. No one, and I do mean no one, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, parents, siblings, no one is divorced in my family. You'd have to go like 2 to 3 generations out to find it anywhere in my family tree. And I also don't intend to ever go through it. I'm really intentional in my dating because I think it's a horrific event that creates generational trauma and I want to avoid it at all costs. But if you were to sit me down and ask me how divorce should be structured, specifically when there are kids involved, I do have strong opinions. First, barring any incidents of abuse or neglect, with ample supportive evidence prior to the divorce, kids should be split 50-50. I think it is really creepy and weird and sexist to assume that one parent has innately better parenting skills because of their gender, or that kids are somehow okay with less exposure to one parent because of their gender. How is that okay? What science is that based on? None in the psychology field. In fact, statistics show that kids with 2 parents are more likely to do well in school, stay out of jail, stay away from drugs and alcohol, avoid teen pregnancy, avoid depression, and as adults, be gainfully employed than are their peers with a single parent. Furthermore, I would say that once the custody split is agreed upon, it should be permanent to create stability for the child and for the parents, barring, again, some evidence of abuse or some other unforeseen major life event that would necessitate one parent to take on more of the burden. Secondarily, I would say that when divorce happens, financial split should take place according to pre-agreed upon contracts or prenups, or on a 50-50 split for money earned during the marriage. I think prenups are a great idea for this reason, and I actually wrote about that at Newsmax if you want to read it. Both genders are adults and should have the responsibility to provide for themselves post-marriage. I don't understand how being married precludes one from working again, or why they should expect to keep their same lifestyle when they go down to one income. Now, I could see some circumstances where there'd be an exception to that. Say a woman chooses not to work to raise children, therefore foregoing years of income and career growth, and say her husband up and leaves her one day, leaving her scrambling to provide for herself and the kids when they're with her. And in this circumstance, I could see a valid argument for alimony and child support, but I largely think that should be determined on who initiates the divorce. I also think couples could do a lot more to outline these things in a prenuptial agreement so all parties are aware of the consequences should they leave. It would be smart to have a system where individuals get to determine how these things should shake out at a time when emotions are not running high. I've often heard people say it should be far harder to get married and easier to get divorced, and I tend to agree. Our system makes it really cheap and easy to rush in, but expensive and confusing to get out. And much of this could be mediated by simply requiring couples to enter contracts defining how assets would be divided should the marriage fail. I'll note here that I don't believe government should be involved in marriage at all, but we're pretty far down this pathway, and since our system has tied marriage to finances and assets, a simple contract system would be common sense. This is just loosely how I think a fair court system would decide these matters, but just about everything I just said is not how our system operates. Currently, only a handful of states encourage family judges to set custodial standards for parenting at 50-50. Though encouragingly, there are many states currently considering legislation to make this the norm, and they should. In many places, fathers have to beg the courts to give them custody, even when the kids or other partner wants it. Family courts routinely consign one parent, usually the father, to mere visitor status in their children's lives. Typically, a non-custodial parent sees their kid 4 days per month, plus a few hours, one night per week, maybe a few weeks during the summer. It works out to somewhere between 14 and 20% of the time. That sounds traumatizing. Keep in mind that the loss of a parent is one of the most horrific events a child can suffer, and there are multiple ways to lose a parent. Again, it can't be emphasized enough that this system doesn't just hurt men, it hurts kids. A study that examined 150,000 arrangements conclusively found that children in joint custody suffered from less psychosomatic problems than those living mostly or only with one parent. Those kinds of mental health impacts have lifelong consequences, and yet we continue to let our courts operate recklessly in this regard. The consequences of these decisions also weigh heavily on men. Non-custodial fathers are 8 times as likely to commit suicide as are fathers with children. As leading authority Edward Crook of the University of British Columbia has written, parents with equal parental responsibility post-divorce have better physical and emotional health and less stress resulting from the sense of purpose and personal gratification associated with active parenting. The highest levels of depression occur among adults who have a child with whom they are not living. Now, when it comes to the alimony and child support question, I recognize things are maybe not quite as cut and dry as they are on the question of custody, where our system is clearly biased against men and in the wrong for numerous reasons. I maintain that there is something distinctly unfair about men being asked to pay their partner who is divorcing them significant portions of their income for years to come. However, there are a lot of things to consider here. First and foremost, the well-being of the child. We know children do better with both parents involved, so simply giving primary custody to the parent who can afford them does not make sense. But we also don't want a situation where they live in poverty half the time either. For that reason, I think supplemental child support does make sense, but it should be allocated in such a way that the children's basic needs are guaranteed, rather in such a way that the court tries to make 2 households equal, which is typically the case now. And it should be mandated that those funds only go to the children's needs. The current structure is extremely unfair, especially if the man is being left and has little say in the matter. Furthermore, the way the courts currently allocate child support encourages many women to push for a larger portion of custody because it ultimately puts more money in their pockets. And in the case of alimony, I really only think this makes sense if one person has given up their career for the other, and even then, a period of 5 to 10 years is more than enough time to re-enter the workforce. Furthermore, I still strongly think this should be based on who initiates the divorce. Ultimately, these are very messy questions, and I think couples can and should do a lot more to ensure that they never have to confront them in the first place, and they should create legal agreements that ensure fairness beforehand because you simply do not ever know what another person may choose to do. People are free to make their own choices, but I encourage all women to always keep their careers and not create a life where you are financially dependent on a man. Some of these choices early on would clear up many of these problems that follow down the road. But when it comes to public policy, our government should not be incentivizing women towards divorce or pushing the father out of the home, and currently, that is exactly what our court system does. All of that being said, the myth that women get rich off divorce is a farce. Despite the common perception that women make out better than men in divorce proceedings, women who worked before, during, or after their marriage see a 20% decline in income when their marriage is in, according to Stephen Jenkins, who's a professor at the London School of Economics. His research found that men, meanwhile, tend to see their income rise more than 30% post-divorce. Meanwhile, the poverty rate for separated women is 27%, nearly triple the figure for separated men. So are men treated unfairly in our court system when it comes to divorce and child custody? Absolutely. But are women thriving? Not necessarily. Divorce is awful, and it should be avoided at all costs. And when it does happen, emotionally mature and stable people should make every effort to put the needs of their children first and co-parent and work to ensure that assets are split in an equal and fair way. Ultimately, we need public policies that prioritize co-parenting and that put the financial burden for divorce on the shoulders of those who initiate it, again, barring any abuse or neglect. In conclusion, I want to say this. To the men in my audience who are suffering one of the injustices or societal shortcomings we discussed today, I want to extend my sympathy. I want you to know that you are valued and you are needed in our society. And I'm so sorry for the voices in our culture that seek to strip away your humanity or diminish you to a caricature. Know that this feminist is fighting for equality and justice under the law for you, just as I am for women. And I hope we can see each other's mutual goals, come together, and form an alliance that will expedite those goals. Until next month, keep fighting the system, tear down walls, and stay based.